It's 9 o'clock, so good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the Us Against Alzheimer's AD PACE Ideation Workshop. I'm Deborah Lappin. I'm a principal at Faegre Drinker Consulting, and I have been pleased to work as Senior Policy Counsel and partner with Us Against Alzheimer's for the last 10 years, and it's been a truly thrilling ride. Yesterday's workshop was a striking example of everything this organization has accomplished, and today will be no different. Once again, we're pleased to welcome folks who have been part of our work for the last 4 years on AD PACE, the Alzheimer's Disease Patient and Caregiver Initiative. And we're pleased to welcome those of you who are new to this workshop, Ideation Workshop today. As we stressed yesterday, AD PACE's singular goal is to set the pace and expectation for patient-focused drug development in Alzheimer's, nothing less. Before we begin, a few traditional housekeeping reminders. This is going to be recorded. It is viewed as a public dialogue. We are using a Zoom webinar format, so when you chat, your chat will be shared with all attendees. You're not able to select a particular attendee. We want you to chat. We want to capture your back and forth exchanges about what you're hearing. And of course, we want you then to offer your questions in the Q&A function. We will be watching these, and when we have our fireside chat, after our panel, our keynote presenters, we will try to be sure we're responding to your questions during that particular time in this morning's program. So with that, let's get started. My distinct pleasure to introduce to you someone you all know well. Meryl Comer is a founding board member of Us Against Alzheimer's, and she has served along George, the founder of Us Against Alzheimer's, as the chair of the AD PACE initiative. Based on Meryl's experience as a caregiver over more than 2 decades and her extraordinary memoir, Slow Dance with a Stranger, Meryl has become a globally recognized spokesperson on behalf of caregivers, women, and all who are affected by the lived experience with Alzheimer's. Meryl, it's my pleasure to welcome you and turn the program over to you.
To unmute me. I'm being unmuted by the host. Thank you everyone for joining us today for the workshop. These are very challenging times, and COVID has given everyone a taste of what it's like to feel confined, socially isolated, and very fearful of what comes next, which unfortunately is a large part of the Alzheimer's patient and caregiver journey across disease progression. Yesterday, our fearless founder and chair, George Friedenberg, described our work through the What Matters Most research program. Began as part of a grant from PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, in collaboration with Mayo and UCSF. Over 43 organizations signed on to the initiative known as the Alzheimer's and Dementia Patient and Caregiver Powered Research Network. Trust me, the acronym was even clunkier. One of the outreach efforts was an engagement platform we called the A-List, and the idea was simple. Patients and caregivers knew we all had stories to tell, but they were dismissed and treated as anecdotal. At Us Against Alzheimer's, we believe that the real power lay in turning our collective experiences into evidence-based data. We jokingly called it data with soul. It was also part of a strategy to make certain that those who have raised their hands for research but end up in the 80% screen fail categories have an online community where their insights are validated as they wait for the next available trials. So today the A-List has over 8,000 participants, is overseen by an IRB, and a quick shout out to our team, our lead investigator, Terry Frangiosa, Virginia Bigger, and Amber Roniger. But as many as you heard, we didn't stop with this informal cohort. In response to the calls from Congress and the FDA, we convened patients, industry, advocates, and government to design AD PACE. George saluted our sponsors and those patients and care partners who joined this initiative. A multi-year, multi-phase study designed to bring rigor to the science of us, the lived experience with Alzheimer's. And credit where credit is due. We're grateful to George, Deborah, and our sponsors for sustaining the A-list by bringing it into the AD PACE orbit. At yesterday's session, we heard remarks from three powerful presenters, Dr. Janet Woodcock, Congresswoman Diana DeGette, and Dr. Goldie Bird from Wake Forest University. For a quick recap, and for those who missed it, let's hear first from Dr. Woodcock, who offered us a reminder of the long road to get where we are today when it comes to patient-focused drug development.
Now, the idea of patient-focused drug development, it took root actually just a little over a decade ago. Obviously, people had been doing research into patient-reported outcomes and so forth for many years. But the idea of being integral to drug development only started at that time. And it's really amazing to think how far it has come in the interim. It's really good news, I think, for patients and for all of us. Now, the idea then of patient-focused drug development and patient centricity was further instantiated by Congress in the Cures Act a number of years ago. So now it's official and has been for some time. So now we have patient-focused drug development, and that's for the developmental phase, the investigational phase. And we have PCORI doing the healthcare research, so the use of patient centricity within healthcare. And this also is extremely important because that's really where the rubber meets the road.
Dr. Woodcock also stressed that outcomes in real-world settings will be driven more by the social determinants of health than the effects of the molecule. And then Congresswoman Diana DeGette and George Vredenberg, our stalwart advocate that he is, engaged in a forthright conversation that lit up the chat rooms. Let's take a look.
Also, because of the interruption of the clinical trials, which is a real concern to researchers around the country, here in Colorado at the Anschutz Medical Center at the University of Colorado, but across the country, we've developed legislation to try to stabilize and help these research institutions. And it is a bill that I'm leading with some other members, and it's got really broad bipartisan, bicameral support.
Well, let me just put in a word comment, because certainly in the Alzheimer's field, but also in many other therapeutic areas, half of the clinical trial sites and institutions that support clinical trials are privately owned. And the legislation right now focuses on research institutions supported by NIH, which is academically centered. But we're seeing a third or so of the private clinical trial sites that are essential to our clinical trial infrastructure going out of business. And so we have been urging Senator Blunt, and we've talked to Fred about this, to include private trial site support in that continuation of the research capacity that we need for clinical trials.
Thank you for that information, and I'll talk to Fred. We'll look at that. That's good information.
That's classic George, not missing a moment to lobby on our behalf. George also spoke with Dr. Goldie Bird on efforts needed to assure greater diversity and minority representation across all Alzheimer's trials.
Paul, to go back to your other question about the statistical significance of some of these studies, I think sometimes we should plan to oversample underrepresented groups, period. And not only get what's represented for the country, or for the state, but just plan to oversample if we feel like statistical significance is needed. And then with regard to your other question, certainly you have to tie it to the funds, to the funding. As you say, some policies are in place, they should be revisited, and the accountability has to be beefed up. I mean, just as with every NIH R01, there are certain components of that proposal that is evaluated on study section, and that this should be evaluated as well. So I've been on study sections as well as councils for NIH, and I know that successful proposals get pushed along when people have been funded for decades, because there is this feeling that they can do the work. But this is one component that is not evaluated as robustly. I'll put it that way.
Speak to the current status and the future potential for real-world evidence in terms of a better assessment of potential design for drugs, the clinical evaluation of those drugs, and the evaluation post-approval of the impact of medicines on real-world populations. What do you see as the benefits of greater attention to real-world evidence, its current status, and its future? It's a narrow question to finish the questions.
Yeah, so it's very, very important and that goes without saying. I think we have to think beyond drugs as for Alzheimer's disease, as complex as Alzheimer's disease. We really don't know where one is at this time or how soon it will be. All of our fingers are crossed and we're working ourselves to death for it. But I think also in terms of assessments and real world evidence around, how do we assess patients? They respond differently based upon their experience, their life's experience, their real world experiences. Mm-hmm. And so there will have to be some attention paid to that. And again, I think the overlay of social determinants will make a big difference in how we make decisions about therapeutics as well as other kinds of interventions. So the real world evidence is a part of the whole package. And yes, I believe in it. I think I think we're at the beginning stages, however.
The link to the full recording of these sessions will be posted next week on the Us Against Alzheimer's website, and we hope you take the time to review it. Now I'd like to turn it over to Russ Paulson, Chief Operating Officer for Us Against Alzheimer's, and welcome again Deborah Lappin to lead us in today's session. Russ?
Thank you. Thanks, Meryl. Thanks for refreshing us on yesterday. So I know a lot of you were with us yesterday, but not everybody was. So we're going to go through, Deborah and I are going to go through kind of briefly an overview of what we have done so far with AD-PACE, what we've learned so far, and sort of some ideas on where we might go in the future. We'll try to keep it brief for those of you who were here yesterday. I just hit the high points. Those of you who were not here yesterday and are interested in more, just reach out to Deborah or me. Our emails are going to appear later in the deck, but reach out to either of us and we're happy to provide more information to you, and including ways to get involved in future work with AD-PACE. So we're going to talk about the vision for where this whole work came from. Meryl talked a little bit about the history. We'll talk about our current state of our vision. We'll talk about the program that we've done so far in research, and then again, what are we going to try to do with the workshop, which follows this public session for people who really want to dive deep. So, as Meryl mentioned, 4 years ago, we started the process of developing something that's more rigorous and more science-based about the Alzheimer's lived experience. And today, we've kind of come to a vision that's outlined here on this chart. Decisions made that impact the lives of those affected by Alzheimer's will be made based on an understanding of what is most meaningful to them. It's simple words, but to be clear, we mean all decisions. Clinical care, clinical trial design, drug approval, coverage decisions, all regulations, all decisions that affect the lives of people living with Alzheimer's. And I also want to be clear that we mean everyone. This is not a vision that encompasses people who live, only people who live near academic medical centers, people who live in cities, people who are easy to find, people who volunteer for a focus group of 5 people to represent the lived experience of millions. And it's not just people with mild cognitive impairment or mild AD or any particular phase of the disease. It is everyone, and it is very definitely for a disease that disproportionately affects Black folks and Latinos, not just non-Latino white folks. So that's the vision. We have been led ably by George Bradenberg and Meryl Comer, who you've seen, but also funded, thankfully, by our sponsors, Biogen, Boehringer Ingelheim, Lundbeck, and Otsuka, the Lead Coalition, Home Instead, Takeda, Lilly, have been great supporters of this. But we've also been very lucky to have people like Meryl and John Winfield, Lee Callahan, Jerry Taylor, Jim Taylor, and Ian Kramer, who you'll hear from later, to advise us as people who have lived experience with disease. As the whole point of this is that the experts in Alzheimer's are actually the people who are living with the effects of Alzheimer's. So, also, almost forgot, thanks our government partners. We have done this in collaboration with CMS, with FDA, with CDC, all along the way. So this is truly a partnership of all who might have something to say and something to contribute. And if you feel like you're one of those people and you haven't been asked, haven't been involved, please let us know, as I said. So with that kind of overview of the vision and kind of who's been steering the ship, I want to turn to the actual day-to-day captain of the ship, Deborah Lappin. Deborah?
Thank you, Russ. You've really, both Meryl and Russ have created the environment for this workshop, which is a conversation, and really appreciate just the way we intend to talk with you, not over you. We want to hear from you as we're moving forward to continue this conversation. And before I talk a little more about the AD PACE program itself, I want to take advantage of a very special guest that we have who elected to join us today for the first hour of our workshop. When she did, I asked her, would you take 5 minutes and speak to our audience? Our very special guest is a very close friend, Dr. Michelle McMurray Heath. And most of you may know, Michelle, a month ago, stepped in as the 3rd CEO and president of BIO. Michelle has already had an extraordinary career. She came to BIO following her time at J&J, where she ended up being the global leader for all of regulatory science. She was the head of evidence generation, broadening access to patients with diverse backgrounds in J&J's programs, and then again leading their interaction with regulatory authorities globally. She came to J&J after being the associate director in the device division at the FDA. There, many, including a few of us on this conversation, credit the device division with Michelle's leadership for really forming the roots of what we know today as patient-focused drug development with her work on patient preference. And I hope Michelle will speak to us about that in the next 5 minutes, given her perch from a member of industry, a policy leader with extraordinary impact on the Hill and through the Aspen Institute and other institutions, and now her leadership at BIO, where again, she is credited with looking at everything we do through the eyes of the patient. Dr. McMurray Heath, I'd like to turn it over to you for just 5 minutes to continue our conversation.
Thank you, Deborah. That was an incredibly kind and generous introduction, and it is a pleasure to have some time to join you all today. I'm hoping that you can all hear me. Is that a thumbs up? Wonderful. Always have to double check these days in the days of new technology. I'm sorry that we're not all together in person. It'd be wonderful to see everyone in the room and have a chance to be with you personally. But it's great to have a chance to speak with you briefly and to hear about the exciting workshop that you've been having yesterday and are going to have today. So patient preference, where have we come and what's left to do? There is a lot left to do. When we started it at the Center for Devices, we were really focused on moving from anecdote to data. So in most medical reviews of new medical products, the reviewer is sitting there trying to balance the benefits and the risk. And it's safer for that individual reviewer to err on the side of caution, to be overly concerned on behalf of the patient. Now that sounds like a very good thing. And we had seen some data out of the EMA out of Europe, their FDA, showing that on average, reviewers were much more conservative when judging new medical products than the patients they were acting on behalf of would have been in the same situation. So we said, how do we inform reviewers in a way that they can rely upon, in a way that's reproducible and quantitatable, that they can actually take what the patients want into account when they're making those judgments and decisions? And isn't it just as important to consider what benefits a patient community is truly hungry for, as well as having a more accurate sense of what adverse events patients find truly intolerable before you make those decisions, instead of just presuming to know? And that's really formed the basis of patient preference. We went out and designed survey tools so that you could ask a patient community, what's more important to you? Having 5 more years of disability-free life, or having an easy to take medication, or having a side effect that might keep you home for several days or weeks at a time? And of course, those answers are going to vary. It's going to vary depending on your stage of life, on your family situation, on what your personal goals are, and they should. But you can look across the population level of patients when you ask that kind of detailed questioning and get a sense of the distribution of patient views. And that lets reviewers and clinicians judge what is most essential to that patient population. And that's all really we ask with patient preference. We ask that the Food and Drug Administration, that other reviewers and regulatory agencies around the globe take time to consider what patients truly want, and not to paternalistically assume that they know. I think that assumption diminishes the great learnings and knowledge and sensitivity and incredible intelligence that we find in patient communities. And it belittles the experience that patients live with every day of getting to know their disease in such an intimate way, much more intimately than anyone else could know their illness. So we just need to have the utmost honor and respect for that knowledge and that lived experience, and find every way we can to channel it in a reliable way to the people in decision-making positions about what new treatments and therapies make it to patients. Because that, at the end of the day, is going to get patients what they want most and what they need most. So I'll stop there, but you can tell I'm passionate about this. But I think it's critically important that you guys are gathered here today to talk about it, but the work's not done. We've seen progress in the device sphere in the US, at least, to accept patient preference data and use it to balance the other scientific and medical data that comes in with reviews. It's still a little bit of an uphill battle in the drug section. I should also say biologics accepts it as well. And around the globe, it's also still a conversation. So we have to keep up the good work. We have to continue to refine the techniques, and we have to make sure that the patient voice is at the table for every critical medical decision that's made. Thanks, Deborah.
Well, Michelle, thank you. People in our audience can understand why we've asked you to join us today. And I would invite Russ and Meryl if they want to come into a quick question or two for you. But we are really proud to have this AD PACE initiative set up as a pre-competitive public-private partnership that the FDA is encouraging. And I think it allows patient groups to really bring their trusted voice and understand where we need to go. We might go back. I'd like to ask Michelle just a question. Do you have specific advice for how we use the data we're collecting to help our industry partners really understand how to take these data in their regulatory submissions? It's a pretty technical question, but you know, early on, how do you start, as if you're an industry drug developer, thinking about the importance of this in your regulatory mind?
Yeah, so we used to refer to it as the total patient product life cycle. You know, at every stage of product development, you can think of how patients can inform your decision making. So you can survey patients to see, you know, what kind of benefits they're really most looking for when you're thinking about product design. If you're on the device side, you can actually engineer your design. Or when you're thinking about your screening criteria, if you're selecting pharmaceuticals. Then you can start asking patients detailed questions about what would make a clinical trial livable for them. Many clinical trials are designed without the true impact on patient lives in the consideration, and then they wonder why it's so difficult to enroll. So, you know, making sure that you are sitting down, doing focus groups, communicating with patients all throughout the clinical trial design. And then, of course, making sure that you're using the patient preference data to know if you're hitting your target, not just your placebo-controlled trial, which of course is important, but knowing whether you're actually reaching and serving the patient needs as well. And that should be your definition of success. And I think when you do that, and then you're going to payers and regulators and clinicians with your product, you'll also have the strength and backing of the patient community behind you. And that's more important today than ever.
Well, you couldn't have said that any better from my perspective. And I know we promised you 5 minutes, and I think we've taken that. And I just want to say thank you again,
Of course,
for joining us.
Thanks.
And Russ, if you agree, I'll continue now.
Yes, we could spend an hour, but I think maybe, you know, since we said 5 minutes, we should be closer to
Yes. And I now am going to move into a very brief overview. And I'm going to assume that most of you were with us yesterday. And if you weren't, that you can actually come onto our website and look at the whole transcript of these 2 days. So the What Matters Most study, importantly, to ground us again, has 5 component parts. The first is the qualitative section, where we had 60 one-on-one interviews, and we tested and listened to what were the concepts of interest that matter to people. We took the wealth of what we heard in those interviews, and then in the second phase of the study, took those concepts of interest, compared them with 3 other global studies, and winnowed them down to 42 resounding and distinct concepts of interest for people across the AD lived experience. And you'll see that we had groups 1, which were people who are asymptomatic but with underlying pathology. Group 2, those with MCI or subjective complaint. Group 3, mild AD. Group 4, moderate AD. And group 5, severe AD. Group 4, we had with the caregiver. Group 5, we interviewed the caregiver. Then we moved into the quantitative study. In that study, we took 260 well-phenotyped individuals and asked them to rate from least important to most important to them these 42 items. And Russ will talk about those findings in a moment. The next phase of the study was to take what we had done so far in the survey instrument we used in the quantitative study and move it into, and we're working on that now, an instrument that can be widely used across diverse populations and potentially with other populations longitudinally, to understand for a single individual how what matters most to that individual changes as the person progresses through various stages of the Alzheimer's disease experience. And then finally, we are in the middle of a tech assessment and gap analysis, where we are taking the clinical outcome assessments, COAs, that are used today widely in our clinical trials. And we're mapping those to the 42 concepts of interest, and that you can see where this is going. We will be able to know with a standard measure that is frequently used as an endpoint in a trial, how it maps to a concept of interest that the patients and caregivers are saying is most meaningful to them. And we'll find out whether there are certain concepts of interest that don't map to 20 of the most widely used instruments today. All of this work will be presented in posters at the AAIC, or has been presented in posters. And finally, I want to thank and recognize our partners in all of this work. Brett Hauber, our PI from the RTI Health Solutions, and his co-PI, Dana DeBenedetti. These folks have become friends, they've become colleagues, and they've truly become experts in Alzheimer's as they have conducted this work. Russ, over to you.
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks for that overview. And as Deborah said, we're going to assume most of you were here yesterday, but we know that there are some who aren't, so I'll go over some of what we learned as we went through the process to date. We have more to go, as Deborah said. So the first thing we learned was in that very first phase, in the qualitative phase where we were talking to patients, doing what Dr. McMurray-Heath said, listening, detailed interviews with patients. We had people across the spectrum of the disease. We went into great depth, long interviews, coded them. But in the design, we had intended that at one break, there'd be a break point, a clean break point, where at some point the disease has progressed so far that we'll need to talk to the caregivers. But before that point, we'll talk to the patients. And the folks at the FDA that we've been talking with remind us that patients and caregivers are not the same, and that the perspectives can be different. There's research on that. So we wanted to have a clean break point. And in group 3, what we found, group 3 being the people with mild AD diagnosed, was that some patients felt like they needed their caregivers there, and some patients did not. So, and that was fairly consistent throughout those interviews. We actually made an adjustment when we went to the quantitative phase. But it showed to us that there is a fair amount of heterogeneity in mild AD. And it may be useful for researchers to think about that as we characterize patients and do studies, but also as doctors sort of diagnose and talk to their patients. What exactly is mild AD if there's such a heterogeneity about independent functioning and feeling like they can do an interview? Something to be aware of. So the second finding we had, and this is really mostly going to be of interest to the real scientists in the group, getting down to 42 concepts of interest. If you look through the literature, when we coded those 60 interviews that we did in depth, we got up to north of 100 things that were things I want to maintain, things I worry about losing, capabilities I want to have, etc. Concepts that mattered to people with dementia or people with risk of dementia. And through some pretty extensive work, we brought those 100 and some down to 42 in order to test. And so just getting to a nomenclature of 42 things that matter to patients, I think was an interesting insight and something that, as far as we know, had not been done before. So now there was this potentially standard lexicon of things that we can talk about between doctors and patients, between researchers and patient groups and patients themselves. So we all have a similar language that we can use. And then the next thing we found was in doing the quantitative study. Now, we called the study What Matters Most, but because there are 42 items, you can't do forced ranking with 42 items and get people to sit through it, especially when you're talking to 260 people across the entire spectrum of the disease. So we asked, instead of doing rankings, forced rankings, we did ratings from not important at all to extremely important. And what we found is that those 42 items are actually all pretty important. The lowest sort of median rating was like moderately important. So we think that we have found 42 items that matter quite a bit to people with disease or at risk of having the disease. We did have some that floated to the top, and there's if you look at this slide in group 2, it says with MCI or SCC, subjective cognitive complaint. In a lot of the literature that I've seen, it's called subjective memory complaint. And there's an awful lot of sort of pop culture stuff about Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment being about memory. And what we learned really clearly in talking to patients, as Dr. McMurray-Heath said, talk to the patients. We talked to the patients and we learned that memory is really not at the top of their list. There are a lot of other issues that come to the top of this list of a bunch of things that matter, but really what truly matters most are things around emotional well-being and not being down, depressed, anxious, worried. More important than activities of daily living, more important than remembering the names of my kids. And we think that's important as we go into this phase that we're in right now of the tech assessment, looking at what are we measuring now? And how does that compare to what patients really have told us matters a lot? So we're in the middle of that process now. We are going to publish on the full results, both from the qualitative study and the quantitative study. Those will be in journals because it's more important than just a few of us on this webinar today and yesterday can hear. We want everyone to have this information. We'll also be publishing on the tech assessment, which we're in the middle of. There's some information that will be coming out in poster sessions at the AAIC, so sign up, stay tuned for that. And as Meryl mentioned, we'll be continuing to listen to patients through the A-list, and we have been listening to patients quite a bit through the A-list during COVID and learning how COVID-19 is affecting people with dementia. We know it has been terrible, terrible, terrible for people living in assisted living facilities. And what we've learned in talking to people who are living with dementia and people who are caring for people with dementia, there's an added layer of awful when you're living in an assisted living facility and your loved one, you don't know how they're doing. They're used to relying on you for being their medical spokesperson, for noticing symptoms that maybe you can't give voice to anymore. It has been a really awful thing. And we've learned a lot about that through surveying people through the A-list. So as you see, we've done a lot, work remains. We've split up into work groups to talk about what's coming next. And those, the work group 1 met yesterday. Work groups 2 and 3 will meet after we're done today to really think about what is next with what matters most. So to capitalize on the opportunity for the astronomical data, we need to know, what does that mean? How are we going to do this? We know that we're going to publish. I mentioned that a second ago, but where, what? Are there things that we're missing that were really of interest that we should publish maybe in a narrower or wider, broader publication? Maybe this isn't all just for refereed academic journals. Maybe there's broader implications for the field and for people living with the disease that we ought to be thinking about. We had talked in the beginning, actually before I ever joined the 80 PACE initiative, before I joined Us Against Alzheimer's, they talked about a data warehouse. What does that look like? Is it important? How do we share data with the field? We have Sudhir coming on just a little bit, and he will talk about one of the mothers of all data warehouses at CPAP. We also want to talk about, where do we go next? Where do the data what are they showing us? Where are they taking us? And most importantly, what have we learned so far so that we can inform people for the community around patient-focused drug development? If you're not involved, we invite you to join us. My email is at the bottom, as is Deborah's, and we invite anyone who's curious to reach out to us. So, Deborah, I think we should move on now from us talking to the people that people came to hear, Dr. Tunis and Dr. Kumaran.
Thank you, Russ. And I agree. This has been an amazing conversation. We're a little behind on the program timing, but I think it's been well worth it. So now I'm really honored to introduce you to 2 distinguished speakers who will lead us in a keynote presentations, Dr. Sean Tunis and Dr. Sudhir Subakamaran. First, Dr. Tunis will help us look at how data on outcomes that matter most can be used not only to inform regulatory submissions, but of equal importance to inform payment determinations. And yesterday, Janet Woodcock and Diana DeGette said, a drug that's approved but can't get to people because they don't have access is really what? A drug that never realizes on its promise. And then Dr. Sivakumaran will talk to us about how we construct rich data that others can use and that we can build, and particularly how we think about using what we know now in real world evidence development. So for our first speaker, I'm going to turn to Dr. Tunis, who served as Chief Medical Officer at CMS from 2000 to 2006. He has just stepped down as the chair for the International Health Technology Assessment Association. He has a distinguished career coming from a Bachelor of Science in History of Science, which I love, at Cornell, and then on to get his MD and his MPH at Stanford. And he leads this conversation on clinical evidence for healthcare delivery and health policy decisions. So Dr. Tunis, over to you.
Yes, good morning, Deborah. Can everybody, you can see me and hear me, I hope?
We can.
Okay, well, it looks, and you can also, of course, see my attic office in Baltimore, Maryland. Still getting used to presenting from without an audience and from here, but it's really an honor to be here. And I want to thank Deborah and George and Meryl and all the work that they've done over the years and involving me in this fascinating, important work. So what I want to do is sort of pick up on a comment that Michelle made just a little bit earlier in the very rich discussion you've had already about this idea of going from understanding what matters most to patients to how that influences decision makers. I hope I've captured that notion accurately, but that's obviously the important piece here, is going from learning what matters most to patients and caregivers to having that incorporated into regulatory, and where I'm going to focus more on market access decisions, including coverage and payment and pricing, et cetera. And I and I hope that you'll see as I go along how important the work of the AD PACE initiative is in making this connection from understanding what matters most to influencing decision makers, and again, in my case, talking about market access decisions. So, so obviously, in the context of reimbursement, market access, et cetera, the big focus these days is on value-based payment, value-based pricing, value-based healthcare, et cetera. And you know, the kind of a key to this whole discussion is that defining value is a matter of perspective. And you know, for somebody who's marooned on an island, you know, a boat is a fantastic thing, and for somebody who's stuck in a boat, the land seems like the most precious thing. So, you know, sort of picking up on that, the idea that, well, in healthcare, the perspective that you want to make sure not to underemphasize is the perspective of the patients who are receiving care. Next slide. So there's a lot of debate and discussion about what does value actually mean. So I like to go back to, you know, the simplest possible definition provided by the Institute of Medicine in 2006 is value is health outcomes achieved per dollar spent. It's probably oversimplified, but it's a good working definition. And then in a 2010 New England Journal article, Michael Porter, who many of you would know is kind of the father of value-based healthcare, and started the ICHOM, an important organization in defining meaningful outcomes and defining value. So the health outcomes are inherently condition-specific and multidimensional, which sounds a little mysterious, but it just basically means the outcomes that matter to a patient with diabetes are different than the outcomes that matter to a patient with asthma, and there's not a single outcome, there's multiple outcomes. So mysterious sounding statement, but basically pretty straightforward. So I'm going to try to get this across using an analogy that hopefully will resonate for folks. And if you go to the next slide, you'll recognize this. You don't need to actually be able to read much of the details, but you'll recognize this as a table from a Consumer Reports article. This one happens to be on electric drills and screwdrivers. And down the left-hand side is all of the different manufacturers, or, you know, different alternative products. And then along the top, the column labels are labeled things like speed and power and runtime and charge time. And I'm going to equate those to health outcomes. They're performance measures. For electric screwdrivers, if the list on the left-hand side was different drug therapies or other interventions for a given condition, then the list at the top would be the outcomes. And the key point here is that, you know, Consumer Reports goes through a process probably somewhat as sophisticated, or not quite as the What Matters Most, the AD PACE project, in talking to a lot of consumers about what they would care about when they're purchasing an electric screwdriver. You know, I want it to run a long time on a single charge. I want it to have plenty of power to, you know, screw in difficult screws, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's not sort of a random selection. That is a limited set of performance features that that consumers have said matter the most to me when I'm purchasing one of these products. And then the Consumer Reports folks develop bench tests to measure each of those performance features or outcomes, and then provides this table about how each of the alternatives performs on that limited set of 6 or 7 or 8 performance metrics or outcomes. So what makes this useful as you know, if you're someone that's getting ready to buy an electric drill, is that you have standardized outcomes measured in the same way for every product that you're considering. And then through this, and then if you know the price, it enables you to be a value-based consumer, right? Because you understand value is a function of these important measures. If you go to the next slide, and if you saw a Consumer Reports table like this, where each of the dashes in the boxes is for a product where that performance measure or outcome wasn't reported, this would be useless. Nobody would buy the magazine, because you have different information on the critically important outcomes for all of the different products. So it's not useful to, there's no way to compare apples and oranges on all of the features that we know are most important. And so, if for those of you who have done systematic reviews of scientific literature, you'll realize that this is actually a pretty good representation of an evidence table from a typical systematic review, where different outcomes measured different ways using different instruments are reported in trials for different alternatives. And so I hope this is kind of starting to converge on the notion that what is really important, if you want to sort of be part of the value-based healthcare discussion, is to be doing the kind of work that the AD PACE program is, which is identifying what should the column labels be of the outcomes that matter most to people who are going to be using therapies for Alzheimer's disease. So if you go to the next slide, what basically that set of key measures or key outcomes is referred to as a core outcome set. And the definition of that, it's an agreed standardized set of outcomes that should be measured and reported as a minimum in all clinical research in a specific area of healthcare. That's a definition from the COMET initiative. You can go and look on their website. They have a huge searchable database of core outcome sets for many, many, many different conditions. And their hope is that folks will refer to those core outcome sets when designing clinical trials, so that there's this consistency in what the outcomes are, and that those outcomes are the ones that matter most to decision makers. So I'm going to go through now fairly quickly some work that we did when I was at the Center for Medical Technology Policy, working with the National Hemophilia Foundation and McMaster University, and a bunch of collaborators, to develop a core outcome set for gene therapy for hemophilia. And again, I want you to be sort of thinking about this as where it might be possible to go further with the information that's being gathered through the AD PACE project in the context of Alzheimer's disease. So next slide, please. So the goal here is you can kind of imagine we wanted to develop a core set of outcomes that measure effectiveness and value for gene therapy in hemophilia. The expectation was and is that these gene therapies for hemophilia are going to be enormously expensive, and in order for them to be taken up, you want to make sure that the value of those is going to be demonstrated by the outcomes that are viewed as being most meaningful. So outcomes associated with a cure, as in gene therapy, may be different than for existing treatments. They should focus on the patient perspective. And the key thing is that once these are decided upon as core set, that those at least should be measured in all trials, and I'll get to a little bit later, all post-approval real-world studies, where you know you're going to want to be able to look at real-world data in order to continue to evaluate value over the long term. I'm going to grab a quick drink. Okay, next slide. So as Deborah has emphasized, this kind of work is really important that it be done in a kind of a multi-stakeholder, pre-competitive context. And so we had virtually all of the companies developing gene therapies in hemophilia working with the National Hemophilia Foundation, leading patient advocacy group. And as you'll see, next slide, please. These were our stakeholders that were involved in this consensus process to identify these core outcomes. It included patient representatives, US payers, clinicians, government agency representatives, participants from each of the companies developing products. We had folks from the International Health Technology Assessment payer community, methodologists, and academics. So a very heterogeneous group. It was, I believe it was about 52 people, 6 of whom were patients with hemophilia. Next slide. And you know, as with AD PACE, we started off with kind of a literature review and identified about 59 outcomes that were commonly used in trials of hemophilia, and sort of narrowed this down through a kind of a modified Delphi process with this stakeholder group, and each round attempted to hone in on not just the outcomes that were identified as important, because all of these outcomes are considered somewhat or very important, but trying to hone in on a key set, because again, if you're going to be able to compare apples and apples at the end of the day, you can't have 42 outcomes, because nobody's going to do that in every study. It's too much data, particularly for trials. So you need to get down to the what matters most of what matters most, that subset. I think you might be able to see, but I can just explain it, that the way we kind of, because we had a multi-stakeholder group where 6 of them were patients, we kind of set up a decision rule in this modified Delphi process whereby the if the patients uniformly rated an outcome as extremely important and the other stakeholders did not, that outcome still was taken forward to the next round of the Delphi. Next slide, please. And so here's an example for gene therapy and hemophilia, where all of the stakeholder groups, which are along the bottom of this chart, reported the frequency of bleeds as you know, highly important, a score of 7 to 9 on the y-axis. So so there's across all stakeholders, frequency of bleeds was viewed as critically important. If you go to the next slide, on this one, the mental health outcome was uniformly ranked as extremely important by all the patients. And as you can see, there's a lot of divergence in the rankings for the other stakeholder groups. But by our decision rule, this one was carried forward into the next round of the Delphi. Next slide. And so here on the right-hand column under outcome, those are the 6 outcomes that were ultimately converged upon across all stakeholders as the most important outcomes to be included in hemophilia gene therapy trials, those 6. So that's the core outcome set. That's what would go across the top of the Consumer Reports chart. And you're right, and critically important is that, and I think, you know, important in terms of implementation in a payer setting, is that the payers were actually at the table and the regulators were at the table as these discussions were going on and the debates about, you know, where to prioritize these outcomes. So it ends up being a set that is not only meaningful to patients, but also kind of endorsed, if you will, by participation of all the other stakeholders. Next slide. And I just put in as a reminder just to talk about is, while obviously a good chunk of the work of the AD PACE program and your efforts have been rightly focused on use of these outcomes in the regulatory context, as was said earlier, patient access doesn't actually happen unless the reimbursement formularies, et cetera, unless market access is also achieved. And so it's critically important, and I know that's the intent of the AD PACE work, to inform not just regulatory, but also market access and pricing decisions. Next slide. I think for the sake of time, just to mention, one sort of reflection of the importance of patient-centered outcomes in Medicare decisions, and obviously Medicare is going to be a critically, hugely important decision maker for future Alzheimer's therapies. When Medicare was looking at the CAR-T for blood cancers in February of last year, the original proposed decision was going to be done under something called CED, coverage with evidence development. So the Medicare's stated intended policy was to pay for this CAR-T therapy, which is, in the sort of $500,000 range, but with a requirement to collect prospective data for each patient who received the therapy. And if you'll see in the third bullet, they were very explicit that that study would include promised measures of quality of life, the PROS, CTCAE for adverse events. And so this was kind of a nod to what was viewed by CMS as an important area, important outcomes to be included in the studies, along with the usual progression-free survival, overall survival, et cetera. Next slide. And then I think this might be my final slide. It was just to comment that, as we've been talking about using these kind of outcomes that matter most to patients in regulatory decisions and reimbursement decisions, and then of course in the real-world evidence, real-world data post-approval studies, it's also going to be critically important that the outcomes that matter most to patients are included in those studies. So no matter what kind of study you're considering, a randomized trial, a pragmatic trial, a longitudinal registry, you have to start with a clear understanding of what matters most to patients, like the work that we did in hemophilia, like the AD PACE work. And once you figure out which of those real-world data elements are reflections of those outcomes, we have to figure out how we're going to add missing but meaningful outcome data. So the point is, getting the outcomes that matter most to patients into sources of real-world data, like electronic health records, claims data, or whatever. In many cases, those sources of data are not actually going to just happen to have information about the outcomes that matter most to patients. In fact, they're very unlikely to in the context of the sorts of outcomes that have been identified in AD PACE. So if we're going to be using real-world data as an important source of ongoing information about the value of these therapies, we're going to have to start with knowing what matters most, and then figure out whether that's either represented in the real-world data or figure out how we're going to get it into the real-world data through other mechanisms like digital health applications. So I think that might be my last slide. Looking forward to—
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, this is just, sorry, the last slide was just a recent report from the Milken Institute on post-approval studies, and it has a lot of discussion about the importance of outcomes that matter most to patients being included in those studies. Okay, thanks.
Oh, Sean, thank you so very much. You've really given us so much to think about, and I'm reminded that Phyllis Farrell at Lilly thinks of what we're looking at as the approval aspects, the access, and the activation components. And Sudhir, I know it's a lot to ask you perhaps to trim your comments down to 10 minutes, but given where we are time-wise, I want to make sure that Ian Creamer has time to interview and talk openly with both you and Sean. So I'm very pleased now to turn the speaker podium over to Sudhir, who heads the critical path for Alzheimer's disease at CPATH. Us Against Alzheimer's remains a very active and committed member of CPAD, and we appreciate the partnership we have with you and your vision to look over multiple data platforms, clinical trial data sharing, large data commons, and think forward about how we really put these data to work, including in a real world evidence environment. So Sudhir, welcome, and we look forward to your comments. Sudhir, we can't hear you. I think your audio is off, just as my video was off a moment ago. Can you turn your audio on? There you go.
Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. Yeah, sure. I'll keep it short, and we can discuss more in the fireside chat. So thanks to ADPACE for this opportunity, and we heard a lot from of these topics being discussed already by the previous speakers, some of the leaders in the field, which is really great. And you know, the fact that they took time out of their busy days to come and speak with us over the last 2 days highlights the importance of the fact that we need to, you know, seriously consider the patient perspective as we go forward in terms of drug development, in terms of advancing an understanding of the disease pathology, and finding meaningful cures. So I'd like to start a little bit by acknowledging the Critical Path Institute, which is celebrating its 15-year anniversary today. And I do have to mention that, as some of you might know, the Critical Path Institute was born out of the vision and idea of Dr. Woodcock and Dr. Ray Woolsey back in 2005. And it was their idea that gave birth to this institute and laid the foundation for what we are today and where we are today, the foundation for tremendous successes and accomplishments that achieved over the last 15 years. And CPAD and the PRO consortium are among the one of the oldest consortiums at the Critical Path Institutes, and we have come a long way in Alzheimer's disease, not just within CPAD, but as a global community in the space, you know, the scientists, the researchers, and the drug development professionals. But there's still a long way to go. But, you know, fortunately, with all the significant advances that's been made, a way forward, which is laid on a very strong foundation thanks to the unparalleled commitment of people like us, people like the ADPACE, the FDA, the industry drug development teams, and most importantly, the patients and caregivers for the sacrifices that they have made while participating in these clinical trials and enabling us gain knowledge and information towards understanding the AD pathology and towards taking meaningful steps for finding meaningful therapeutic intervention. Now, so we have so much knowledge and information, but the key next step is to find out how best we can use that knowledge and information. So if you can please go to the next slide. So I'm not going to go into the detail, and this slide and the next are just an overview of the patient-reported outcomes, but I do want to talk a little bit on the challenges that we have with any such patient-reported outcome, not just really in Alzheimer's disease space, but you know, as we heard before, there are challenges across any kind of outcome measurements across diseases, and it just makes it more complex and complicated within the Alzheimer's space because of the complexity of the brain in general. So we all know that the PROs, or the patient-reported outcomes, have the potential to enhance drug development, facilitate regulatory decision-making, and most importantly, as we heard repeatedly, that the U.S. healthcare system is shifting strongly towards a patient-centered care. But you know, there are a lot of challenges before we have an instrument or a tool that can be put into effective use, meaningful information. And some of the challenges include validating the tool. The validation requires, you know, representative patient populations. And in the case of AD, we know how heterogeneous and diverse the disease itself is across different patient groups, different patient populations, the demographics, phenotype, genotype. So validation is going to be a big challenge. And the diversity and the heterogeneity of the disease obviously leads rise to variability and subjectivity of a patient experience and perception. And you know, Sean just gave a very nice analogy. Not everyone is going to be giving us the same perception of a particular response. It's going to vary from subject to subject, and also within a subject, it's going to vary from time to time, either as they progress through the disease or at different time points when the question is being asked, for instance. The other important challenge that I would like to highlight here is the inaccuracy in self-reporting in the face of cognitive impairment. And we all know that Alzheimer's disease is a progressive disorder. So starting from the early stages, a particular participant will be going this constant change within their brain. So we need to make sure that we have the most accurate information in terms when we have the self-reporting from a patient's perspective, and that longitudinal information as well, so that we can see how a particular patient is responding and how that response is changing over time. So longitudinal data is extremely important. I mean, does it mean that it's going to help us completely eradicate inaccuracy? Not necessarily, but at least it will help us understand how that response is changing over time and help us get as close as possible to being accurate in terms of that self-reporting features or aspects. And finally, a disease-specific PRO measure can be more sensitive to a particular patient characteristic, but it may not have the same level of validation as a global PRO score. And this is something Sean discussed as well. So this is just some of the main challenges that we have when we're particularly thinking about data patient measures. But there are ways to address this, and that's the part reason of this 80-PACE work group and many others trying to find out how we can overcome these challenges and resolve these challenges. So if you can please go to the next slide. So, there are things we can do where we all know that when we are considering a particular measurement approach, everyone must consider the type of outcome assessments that might be the most appropriate, because there are different kinds of patient-reported outcomes or self-reported outcomes. So we need to make sure that we are getting the most appropriate one for a particular aspect of the disease or particular question that we have. So having the right questions at the beginning is important, and make sure that we have the right outcomes to address those right questions. But in terms of addressing the challenges, there are things we can do like considering what's important to the patient from the perspective of burden of disease or treatment and benefits and risk of disease management, side effects, some of the topics which Dr. Woodcock mentioned yesterday, and also ensure that we have the best practices for collecting information which covers aspects of symptoms and how those impact the patient perspective. So, and again, this goes back to the value of the information we are getting from a patient or a caregiver perspective, and make sure that we are measuring this in a meaningful way. That's been repeated often, and it will keep getting repeated as we go forward, and that's extremely important. We need to make sure that whatever we are measuring has to be clinically meaningful. Yes, it's going to be a challenge to make sure whether it's clinically meaningful or not, but that's why we are doing what we are doing. So we need to make sure that every measurement that we have is going to be clinically meaningful. And finally, selecting and developing the right fit-for-purpose COAs to measure the patient experience in clinical trials, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So as we know, the development of a patient-reported outcome process, this is a very high-level summarized overview I got from the website, which is linked there. Starting from creating the framework based on knowledge and literature review, and then the patient input, we modify a framework, which is then subjected to reliability, validity, sensitivity, and specificity as well, before finalizing the the content, the scoring procedures, and the training materials, and so on. Which all leads us to one point, which is the data. So if you can just click on the next, please. So the data is the important aspect of this particular deal that we saw in the previous slide. There are various ways in which the patient-reported outcome data can be impactful, and the most frequent impact is that it involves clinical decision making. And we heard from Dr. Woodcock many times, but one of the occasions which really stands out for me is 5 years ago when she said that what the patients value most in terms of alleviation before we set up a measurement is going to be extremely important as we go into the future to be truly patient focused. And that's something we should always keep in mind as we go forward. Of course, there are other impacts like it informs clinical practice, health policy decisions, it supports regulatory agencies and drug approval processes. And PRO data can also help in assessment of efficacy of a drug and supporting labeling claims. But I want to focus on one particular aspect of PRO data, which is very close to the heart of what we do at CPAT, which is looking at the impact of PRO data from a quantitative perspective, from a quantitative analysis perspective. So if you can please go to the next slide. So going back to this figure we saw earlier, we know that the data is important, and we are going to be getting lots of amounts of data from a PRO instrument, any kind of PRO instrument. And the key is to make the best use of this data. So if you can just click on the next button. Yeah, so this is what we do at CPAT. So within the Critical Path for Alzheimer's Disease Consortium, we take the needs of the AD patients and the drug developers from all aspects, and then using the standardized and curated patient-level data, work on generating novel, quantitative, validated, and endorsed drug development tools. And the figure below kind of shows you an overview of how we do this process. So we start from the metadata level, which leads to the generation of the model specifications based on patient-level data. Then we develop the model, we validate the model, and then we submit it to the regulatory agencies for review and endorsement, which then feeds back into this kind of self-sustained evolving circle where the model is simulated, and then it's out there for the public to be executed, used in a clinical trial situation. Now, the key thing to notice here is it's a circle. It keeps going around. It doesn't start at one point and end at one point. And the reason is because when a particular tool is being used to in a particular clinical trial, it's going to generate lots of amounts of data. And that data is going to feed into this self-evolving sustained process, because the more data we have, the more robust the tools or the solutions that we develop are going to be. It's a constant process of making it better, which will help in generation of better data as we go forward. But there is an important aspect to this, which is that I spoke about a quantitative tool. So these are computational tools, computational models, quantitative models. But there is a way where we can make these models more human in nature, which is where the outcome assessment data comes in. So if you can please click on the next button. So the PR on CR data is extremely important for this effort too. So normally in a quantitative model, it's based off on biomarkers and imaging and cognitive assessments, genotype, phenotype. That's fine. But the PRO data and clinical outcome assessment data are also going to be extremely important in this quantitative analysis, because it's going to bring this very integral and key part of a patient perspective into this whole quantitative effort. So what does this lead us to? Let's say if we assume that we are including this data, where does it lead us? So if you go to the next slide, so we see that the quantitative analysis, including a PRO data, is going to be extremely helpful for helping us identify methods to address missing data. Now, we all know that in a clinical trial, it's not always that we get 100% of the data that we want. There's always going to be missing data, and it's much more going to be common with instruments such as a patient-reported outcome, because not everyone is going to be able to answer every question at all the time that's being administered. So there will be missing data, but we need to find ways to address the gaps, address those missing data. So in addition to identifying the methods to address the missing data, we can also explore the impact of loss of respondent insight, because there might be a time where we'll never get a response to a particular question from a particular subject, but we can explore the impact through a quantitative analysis about what that loss of respondent insight is going to be. And the most important aspect of a quantitative analysis from this data set is the third point, assessment of item performance over time. So it goes back to the importance of longitudinal measurements. So we all know that the general concept of a PR instrument, it starts from the items, and they're categorized into different domains, which all come together in a concept, right? It's a very simplified view, but it captures the process really well. The key aspect here is the items you see on the left. So we have different items, and the items are the ones for which the patients are going to be responding. And that is the key aspect of this whole data set. And these item responses are going to change over time, because the disease progresses over time. And it's extremely important for us to capture the change of those items over time corresponding to the disease progression. And that's what's going to help us have a more comprehensive understanding of disease progression. So longitudinal data collection is going to be extremely important. Of course, all of this leads to further development of the instrument and improving its sensitivity and specificity. And finally, I'd like to touch a little bit on the importance of real-world evidence. So if you go to the next slide, please. So we spoke a lot about the real-world evidence, but I'd like to point out the complexity of the real-world evidence as well. So just like PRO data, the real-world evidence and real-world data also have complex issues that needs to be resolved. One of them is that there is a lack of consensus of standardized outcomes for longitudinal measurements. So that needs to be addressed, actually, because all the data has to be standardized and harmonized in a meaningful manner. And we have to make sure that we address the aspect of the poor transferability of outcome measures across different studies. It's going to, again, different studies capture different patient populations, so the real-world evidence is going to be different. contributes to the heterogeneity and variability, but we need to account for that fact, consider it, and see if there is a way to resolve it. And finally, associating the changes in different aspects of the disease, like cognition and function and behavior, the uncertainty in that process will contribute to the challenges in disease progression modeling. So modeling is not the magic trick. So we have to remember that whatever the model is going to give us as an output depends on what is being given at the beginning. So what goes into the model is what comes out of the model. So the data, the making sure that we collect the right data at the right time with the relevant aspects and in the most meaningful way is going to be key to making sure that the models are fine. So if you go to the next slide. So, and again, there are ways in which we can address these things by optimizing the data collection, making sure that we are measuring it in a meaningful way, in a clinically meaningful way, and capturing all the relevant aspects of the disease, like the cognition and function and behavioral outcomes. And if we make sure that we are addressing all of these aspects, the final disease progression and health economic modeling from a quantitative perspective is going to be the most meaningful and more robust in terms of us interpreting the results. And I'd like to end by sharing a few thoughts on what we at CPAT internally consider or keep talking about all the time as recommendations. So if you go to the next slide. So, this is something we have a lot of discussions internally and also with external stakeholders, which is that it's extremely important and crucial and critical to engage with the industry drug development teams to integrate any kind of exploratory PRO or COAs in ongoing AD trials, because the more we do that, the better we can correlate a patient-reported, self-reported outcome with an actual pathology of the disease from the perspective of biomarkers or images, cognitive assessments, because that's going to be extremely crucial. And then making sure that we have consensus standards for unified collection and harmonization of the data. And finally, of course, I use CPAT as an example here for obvious reasons, because we are a unique organization where we're not just building a library of data sets across various diseases, as you all know. We actually use those data sets to generate meaningful, quantitative, novel drug development solutions. So sharing all this data is going to be extremely key, which falls under the general concept of data sharing in a broadly accessible manner. So the more we do that, the better we can help in developing those tools, which will help optimize clinical trials for drug development. So that's my last slide. And the next slide, I'd just like to acknowledge, if you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, the Critical Path Institute, once again, I've learned a lot in the last 1 year, and it's, it's always important for me to acknowledge that mainly Diane Stevenson, who formerly led the Alzheimer's Consortium, who's now leading the Parkinson's space, and Dr. Klaus Romero, who's the Chief Scientific Officer, have been absolutely instrumental in advancing the work that we do within at CPAT, and in also helping me be informed and increase my knowledge in the space. So, and finally, the Critical Path Institute cannot do what we do without the generous daily support of the FDA, which also comes in the form of funding. So we are extremely grateful for that, for this grant that we got from the Critical Path Public-Private Partnerships from the FDA. And we look forward to making the best use of that as we go forward and work with you all in the future. So once again, thank you very much. I know that was really fast, but I'm happy to take it slow in the fireside chat and answer any questions. So thank you once again for this opportunity.
Sudhir, thank you. And Sean, thank you. Ian Creamer, who is head of the LEAD Coalition, advocate, and exquisite policy leader. I don't envy your role at this point. We are going to extend this session for at least until 10:40. And Ian, with that, I'm turning it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Sudhir. Thank you all who've joined us this morning, and we'll try to be as efficient as we can with questions. Let me assure everyone that if we don't get to all the planned questions, and if we don't get to all the live questions that have come in through the Q&A box, we'll make sure to share those questions with Sean and Sudhir after this session and solicit their responses and try to incorporate that into the post-workshop reports that we'll be able to share more broadly. So please inundate us with your questions through the Q&A feature in Zoom at the bottom of your screen, and we'll make sure we address as many of those as possible. And with no further ado, we'll jump into the first question. And I'm just going to offer each question to both Sean and Sudhir for any comments they want to make. It seems like from what we've heard from both your presentations that patient advocacy organizations, if not uniquely or at least especially well positioned to develop real world data platforms. If that's your view as well, Please let us know if you think there's an opportunity, particularly for the Alzheimer's community, to develop a registry and collect real-world evidence to further characterize the disease's everyday impact on new symptomatic and disease-modifying therapies that, as we know, may be coming to market as early as next year. And then, in particular, where you think our opportunities are to avoid pitfalls that maybe other disease state patient advocacy organizations have encountered as they've tried to develop registries and other tools. So Sean, why don't we start with you, and then we'll move to Sudhir for a response.
Yeah, so I think that there is, lots of models that would work for kind of collecting post-approval data, and to some degree, it's most appealing that a coalition that was patient-led or a patient advocacy organization would be kind of the convener and organizer. I don't think that's the only model that works. I guess a key point I wanted to say is that what seems to happen naturally with a lot of post-approval data collection is individual companies set up registries for their products. And that seems like a suboptimal approach. I mean, not a useless approach, because obviously it generates a lot of interesting information, but it seems as though there's a potential for a lot of duplication of effort and inability to aggregate data if each company with a product is establishing their own platform. So it seems to me like, and Deborah and others have mentioned it, this pre-competitive model, the sort of platform that the Critical Path Institute has established are appropriate. And actually that Milken Institute report that I put in the end of my slides does have discussion of a bunch of different platforms that are in place for post-approval data collection and some of the pros and cons.
So it sounds like that works, having that sort of consensus or collaborative model works especially well, given that we understand companies are going to come to market with different types of products for different stages of disease, different symptoms or health outcomes of disease, and they're going to come over a different period of time. So if you're trying to integrate the longitudinal approach that Sudhir specifically talked about repeatedly, along with the consensus model that you're discussing, getting every one of those potential stakeholders together at the same table at the same time, well in advance of reaching market, sounds like a critical element. Am I understanding correctly where you're going with that?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Oh. And again, I think there's a lot of variations in flavors, but I do think the sort of the default that has been the model to date, except for some exceptions, is multiple individual product registries. And I think, even though I understand why it's difficult to go at it differently, including funding and governance and all that stuff, from a what's best for patients point of view, you need all the data to be together and to be able to have harmonized endpoints, longitudinal follow-up, and then just use resources efficiently, because there's not an infinite amount of resources and it's expensive to do these things.
Great. Sudhir?
I think you both covered it really well, and I would just stress that point. There are a lot of people collecting a lot of data, and in a way, you mentioned the fact that is there a way to avoid pitfalls as we go forward. In a way, the complexity of the disease will make the pitfalls in there, and we cannot avoid it. But that's okay, because the more it's all a learning experience. But the key is, as Sean was pointing out, to make sure that we integrate and find a way to aggregate all of this data and within a common consensus standard and harmonize them, whether it's being held at CPAT or in another place. We need to bring it all together. And I like the last point which Sean mentioned, which is that and then once we aggregate the data, make sure that the data is being used in a meaningful manner. And that's what, we going back to what CPAT has done over the last 15 years, all the data, and we do collect a lot of registries in other places. We have registries in other diseases within the organization, but all of those data sets are being put into meaningful quantitative analysis and use. And ultimately, that's what's going to help us understand the patient perspective much more than, getting a response to a question. Of course, we can understand what they're trying to say from a question, but what does that response mean from a disease progression perspective is going to depend on us aggregating all this information in a harmonized way and analyzing them in a meaningful way. So.
Great. So thank you for that. Sudhir, just to follow up and maybe learn a little bit more about how Critical Path either is doing this work or could do it. Do you have representation of patients directly in your governance structure when you're looking at an Alzheimer's model? That's one of the things that's really nice about the AD PACE model, that there are people living with dementia that are on the executive steering committee. Is that replicated in any way at CPATH?
So we do have patient advocacy organizations part of the consortium or part of any work that we do. And more recently, I think in the other consortiums, particularly people like Parkinson's and in Duchenne, there are lots of patient organizations and advocacy groups who are part of the consortium strategy as a whole. So that goes all the way from data sharing and facilitating the process of data sharing, but also towards developing those quantitative solutions or a tool or an instrument, because that's what's going to make us even answer to some of the questions we get from the regulatory authorities when we send a tool for endorsement. They're going to be like, okay, did you consider patient perspective? So we do work with that. And within the Alzheimer's Disease Consortium, we do have representation and participation from those patient communities and patient organizations. And we always encourage that. And we sometimes actually be proactive in reaching out to them as well. Once our consortium's goals and work goes on, we make sure that they are included and they will be included. And finally, again, we need data, right? So everyone needs data. So anytime anyone is willing to share data with us, the better it is actually to incorporate and aggregate all the patient perspective.
Got it. And the next question, Sudhir, I'll start with you, but Sean, feel free to weigh in on this as well. It sounds like from what you've said, maybe there's a sense that the Alzheimer's field needs a new PRO. And you've identified some of the pitfalls and some of the ways to overcome or avoid those pitfalls that have befallen other disease states as they've worked on PROs. I heard most crisply and clearly longitudinal data as being a key element of avoiding or overcoming the pitfalls. Are there a couple of others that you would particularly call out in that longer list that you just think are essential for us to overcome or avoid from the get-go?
That's a good question. So I don't know if the answer to your first part of the question is like, do we need a new PRO? I don't know if I can answer that. And I don't know if you really need a new PRO. There's lots of instruments and questions out there already. The key is, if we are going to help or work towards generating a new instrument going forward, we need to first find out, okay, what are the gaps that this instrument is going to fill that the previous instruments did not fill? And secondly, okay, is it important to fill those gaps? Is that process of filling that gap going to be meaningful? And finally, whether the new PRO instrument or the existing PRO instrument, we need to be ultimately focusing on making sure that any measurement or response we get is going to be clinically meaningful. So if you ask me, in addition to a longitudinal, the important need for longitudinal information, is there something else we should focus on? Clinical meaningfulness. Yes, it's a very kind of nice word to say, and it sounds easy when we say it, and it's very difficult to put it into perspective. But that's a challenge, and that's why we do what we do. So clinically meaningful information measured in a longitudinal manner by incorporating them into the clinical trials, I would say is going to be the key for either the existing instrument or a new instrument as we go forward.
Okay.
A quick thought on this, because it's a point I wanted to make is, and I'll be interested if Sudhir agrees with this, but in my thinking about what matters most to patients, I think there's a lot of folks that confuse like patient-reported outcomes as being equivalent to patient-important outcomes. And it is sometimes true that the outcome that matters most to patients isn't necessarily patient-reported. So, for example, in the hemophilia example that I gave, actually the most important outcome to patients isn't frequency of bleeds, which they usually self-report. It's factor activity level, which is a lab finding. And the reason it's factor activity level and not frequency of bleeds is factor activity level, when it's low enough, correlates pretty well with the risk of bleeding. The frequency of bleeds, you can actually, if you're a patient with hemophilia, you can get the frequency of bleeds down to 0 by just never doing anything, taking no risks. So it actually was through the project that I described that the FDA, and I believe this is accurate, but as part of those discussions, elevated factor activity level to be a co-primary endpoint with frequency of bleeds because of the importance to patients. So I guess the answer then to the question of do we need a new PRO sort of depends on what the what matters most activity ultimately decides are the most important endpoints. I think, you know, something like a core set. And then it's like, well, okay, once we know what those are, we figure out how they have to be measured. And if it needs a new PRO, it needs a new PRO. But I don't know that you can answer the question by saying yes or no that you do or don't need a PRO until you know which things matter most.
Okay, so that actually dovetails really well into a question we got from our audience. At least I hope it dovetails. So the question from the audience is, given what we know about the 42 what matters most concepts, what is the potential for creating a core AD core outcome set?
Yeah, I think, you know, my thought, so I've seen a bunch of different methodologies used to identify a core set of outcomes. You know, what I think of as usually the 6 to 8, just because for practical reasons in clinical trials, you can't, I don't think you can sort of mandate more than that, right? So, so the idea of a, whether a core set could be developed for Alzheimer's disease, I think you can design the methodology to sort of force the folks making the judgments to prioritize amongst, you know, whatever number you want to get down to a core set. So I think, I mean, unless I'm missing something, I just think it's a matter of how you structure the questions in your consensus process to actually then, you know, prioritize a number less than 10.
Sudhir, do you want to weigh in on that?
I think Sean covered it really well, and I just want to highlight that, you know, I agree with Sean. And going back to the previous comment you made, I do agree with you, and I like the how you put it. You know, it's important for us to not just look at patient-reported outcomes, but, you know, what is important among those outcomes, and make sure that we are capturing that, because it's not always that all the instruments that we have are going to be capturing the most important outcomes. So we need to have that bidirectional engagement with the patients and make sure we are going to get all the aspects which are important and meaningful from a patient's perspective. And yeah, that's going to define whether we end up developing a new PRO or actually modify the existing PRO measures in the framework and make it more robust in terms of, you know, reliability and validity. So that's a question that's going to be evolving over time. And I probably take this chance to answer a quick question I just saw come through online, which is from Dr. Majid, like in terms of the role of a caregiver responses, you know, when it comes to clinical meaningfulness. And the answer is yes. So we talk about patient-reported outcomes, but yes, caregivers are extremely important too. So this whole instrument at some point is going to be dependent on a caregiver response as well. And the clinical meaningfulness, yes, it will be different for both of them, but that's the work that we need to do to interpret and try to identify what's the meaningful information from those two people, the patient and the caregiver, and harmonize them together when we aggregate the data in terms of understanding the overall response to the instrument. So,
could I add just one more thing on that? Is this is a great, you know, a number of years ago we did some work, sort of somewhat like the core outcomes for hemophilia. We actually did some work in Alzheimer's disease with 11 different health technology assessment agencies from around the world to see if we could come to some alignment around key outcomes. And what I remember is it wasn't done nearly as well as What Matters Most, the AD PACE project, but it was interesting that what actually came to the surface was the outcome of apathy, which is actually something that, and again, I don't know the Alzheimer's literature well enough, but obviously that's a caregiver reported outcome, right? Apathy is not, as far as I can tell, probably most likely to be a patient reported outcome. And it's, you know, it was from the caregivers that we actually heard that was a critically meaningful, basically, whether the patient, you know, wants to do anything, get out of the chair, et cetera. So anyway, I just think it goes to the point of what matters most might not necessarily be, you know, patient reported.
So I just want to pick up on a couple of threads there. It's interesting, your observation about apathy as an example. That may depend in part on stage of disease and the relative insight remaining for an individual. We know that often in Alzheimer's, a lot of the same symptoms occur, but not necessarily in the same intensity and the same order from individual to individual. So I will just say that someone that I'm close with is very aware of his own apathy, but maybe my perceptions as a caregiver or someone else's perceptions as a caregiver might be different about that apathy, how we would characterize its intensity, how we characterize its effect on other function and activity and quality of life. So designing for sensitivity to that and getting both, or I should say, not just in a dyad, but maybe it's a triad or beyond. There may be multiple caregivers with multiple points of view, depending on degree of interaction with the individual living with the disease. But that's all leading up to this. One of the things I've been very interested in as we look at that continuum of utility of the data, not only for regulatory approval and for payment decision, but also for clinicians being willing to prescribe and for family members being willing to fill a prescription and supervise utilization, adherence to the use of that prescription, is it's important that the individual living with disease perceive a benefit, and it's important that their family members who are supporting their care and maybe helping with medication management also perceive a benefit in at least two ways. One is benefit to the individual with the disease, but the other is benefit to the caregiver. That if the caregiver feels that they are under less stress because the medication is relieving symptoms for the person with the disease, they're more likely to make sure medication adherence happens, that the prescription is filled in the first place, and stepping back even farther, that they ask the physician, the medical practice, about the potential benefits for their loved one of taking that drug. So as we're looking at these 42 items that matter, and through the course, as we've defined it in 80 PACE, the 5 groups that we've interviewed, can you tell us a little bit about that idea of reducing from 42 to 10, how we capture either directly, how we cluster issues, or perhaps can we use some as proxies? And so I'll take a deep breath after I give you one example. As Russ said earlier, it sounds like a lot of the ADLs didn't rise to the very top, that it was a lot of the emotional well-being issues. To what extent do you think we're seeing in our data that emotional well-being is a proxy for some of those ADL functions? That if people are better able to handle bathing, dressing, toileting, feeding, that reduces their sense of dependence on their caregiver and actually does then reduce caregiver stress?
Was that a question for me?
I'll open it to both, and I apologize. It was a long, multi-part question, but get this proxy idea to help us group down from 42 to say 9 or 10.
Yeah. Well, so let me give you hopefully what's a meaningful answer to this. And again, it's sort of drawn from our experience with these multi-stakeholder groups of 50 to 60 people that are reasonably balanced across all the stakeholders. What is remarkable is how much rich insight emerges from the crosstalk between payers and regulators and clinicians and patients and researchers. And I think it starts to get to, you know, if you have 42 measures, what can we potentially throw out without losing something that's really important, that matters a lot? And it seems to me that it's actually, you know, I hate to say this, but kind of in the room, you know, dialogue back and forth, and people, you know, kind of enriching their own understanding. I mean, even the way you talked about, you know, apathy, you know, I felt like, okay, I get that more than I did before in terms of, you know, patients being able to self-report. But that's the kind of rich stuff that I think emerges from these multi-stakeholder discussions and would allow you to sort of compress from 42 to 10 or 7, knowing that you're going to lose some things that are important, but not the most important things.
Great, and I apologize, we're going to need to wrap up soon. Sudhir, do you just want to take a minute to respond to any of what Sean has said, or to my remarkably long-winded multi-part question, and then we'll throw it back to Deborah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a quick note, and Sean gave some really great points there in his response just now, and I want to highlight the fact that, you know, we need to be mindful of the fact that we cannot have too many questions. Now, how many is too many? That's hard to say right now. We need to engage with the patients, because when we look at the Alzheimer's disease, a patient in the early stage of the disease might be more tolerant of having 50 questions than someone who's in a bit more advanced stage, because they're already under a disease which is extremely complex and heterogeneous and pretty severe. Now, Sean, with all due respect, I'm not trying to minimize something like hemophilia. They are equally important and severe as well. But with Alzheimer's, it's extremely complex. It just affects one of the main important organs of the body, the brain. Now, but at the same time, we need to find ways to narrow it down to a more meaningful number, whatever that number is based on the constitute engagement, and make sure that we are capturing the most important responses, most important outcomes that are going to be meaningful. Now, yes, we might miss some other important factors, but that's okay. But this is where that engagement needs to happen, and the thought process from the perspective of correlating those responses with the biological basis of the disease itself. So that, and in a way, I think, again, I don't know yet because I haven't done this work, but I think when we start doing this longitudinal measurement in clinical trials, we'll be able to narrow down on the most important perspectives from the patient as it correlates to a biological basis of the disease as it progresses. So that's a hypothetical, like a scenario or a question that we have. But I do agree with Song. We need to be mindful of the number of survey questions, make sure we're catching the right ones, and the most meaningful ones. So.
Great. Thank you both so much. Deborah, back to you, and thank you for the time.
Yeah, thank you all. It's time, excuse me, for us really to break, but I just want to say this was an extraordinary conversation. We are listening to your Q&A. We have heard specific questions about ICER and how quality of life measures that ICER seems to use today can correlate with the core outcomes and COA assessments that we're looking at in AD PACE. So we hear that question, and our working group will take it on. We hear your questions about, can core sets be developed in Alzheimer's? And we're also hearing from some of our patient stakeholders on the chat function that apathy has touched a nerve. So much here for us to take over. It is now 10:40. We are going to need to break. I want to say thank you to all of you who have joined us today. We appreciate, and again, we hope you'll contact Russ Paulson or me to talk more about AD PACE. We need all voices, all partners in this initiative, and it's terribly important, we believe, to the field, and this workshop has confirmed that for all of us. So now we'll take a break. We'll be back in 10 minutes, and for those of you who are part of the steering committee of AD PACE, you please note in your calendar, and I think in an email that's just been a reminder, you need to tune into a separate Zoom link for the next part of our day. Thank you all. Stay safe, stay well. Bye.